Normandy, July 1944. The air trembled with the sound of engines, a mechanical tide rolling inland. From the hedgerows above St. Lo, a German reconnaissance officer raised his binoculars. Below him, the valley moved. Sherman tanks, dozens, then hundreds, crawled forward, their olive hulls shimmering in the midday haze. Dust rose behind them like smoke from a great forge. On the road, American convoys stretched beyond sight. Trucks packed with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, even field kitchens. To the German officer, it felt impossible. Only days earlier, they had destroyed an entire armored column. Yet new ones appeared, fully equipped, perfectly maintained, as if conjured from nothing. He noted the serial markings. M4A1, Chrysler. A car company. Building tanks through his lenses, he saw an endless procession. Machines not crafted by hand, but stamped, bolted, and rolled off lines like automobiles. Behind the noise of battle came a deeper realization. Germany was fighting not just an army, but an entire industrial civilization. And across the Atlantic, in cities he'd never seen, factories thundered day and night, producing a new tank every 20 minutes. The secret wasn't in the steel, it was in the factories. In the late 1930s, the world balanced on the edge of an industrial revolution weaponized for war. Europe was already burning. Spain had tested the new engines of destruction, and Hitler's Germany, defying the Treaty of Versailles, had rearmed at astonishing speed. The German system prized precision above all. Each panzer was a work of engineering art, hand-finished, finely tuned, expensive. Factories like Krupp, MAN, and Henschel poured skilled labor and scarce materials into machines designed to dominate by quality, not quantity. It was a philosophy born of pride and tradition, and fatally of limited resources. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched from afar. Isolationist laws held the country back from open involvement, but its industries, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Studebaker, were giants of mass production. In 1939, their assembly lines built cars, tractors, and refrigerators by the millions. The techniques of Henry Ford's moving conveyor and interchangeable parts had turned craftsmanship into choreography. What Germany considered industrial arrogance, America considered efficiency. When war exploded in Europe that September, Washington was still unprepared for a global conflict. Its army ranked 17th in size, smaller than Portugal's. Its tank force numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. Yet beneath that small army lay an economic colossus. President Franklin Roosevelt sensed it. In December 1940, he spoke the words that would redefine the conflict. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." That phrase was more than rhetoric. It was a mobilization order. Within months, car factories retooled for weapons. Detroit's engine plants began producing tank parts. Shipyards in California expanded overnight. Civilian auto production was halted by 1942, freeing every assembly line for war. The German military planners understood American potential, but they underestimated its speed. They imagined an ocean would slow it. They thought democracy would drown in bureaucracy. Instead, industrial capitalism fused with state coordination in a way the world had never seen. By 1941, before America even entered the war, British contracts had already flooded U.S. factories with orders for tanks, trucks, and aircraft under the Lend-Lease Act. Liberty ships were sliding down shipyard ramps faster than U-boats could sink them. Machine tools, raw steel, and rubber were rationed with mathematical precision. The United States had turned war into a production equation. Meanwhile, in Germany, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was fighting a different war. one of logistics and time. Each new German tank model demanded new parts, new tools, new crews to repair them. Factories scattered across occupied Europe were bombed relentlessly. Every innovation added complexity. Every improvement slowed the line. By contrast, American design philosophy simplified. The M4 Sherman was not the best tank on paper, but it could be built fast, repaired easily, and shipped anywhere. Its engine and transmission were compatible with civilian industry. Its tracks could be replaced by mechanics with basic training. It was a product of the assembly line, the first truly industrial tank. As 1942 dawned, the world was shifting into total war. Axis armies held vast territories. German armor ruled the steppes and deserts. But deep inside America's heartland, something massive was stirring. The machinery of peace had begun to forge the weapons of liberation. The transition was not merely mechanical. It was cultural. Millions of American men and women entered the factories. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of an army without rifles, fighting with wrenches and rivets. Industrial might had found its battlefield, and while battles raged overseas, in quiet industrial valleys and city blocks, the tempo of production began to accelerate, to a rhythm the Germans could scarcely comprehend. The arsenal of democracy was awakening. By early 1942, America's cities had become engines of war. Smoke rose over Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Pittsburgh, not from ruin, but from creation. Where cars once rolled off polished floors, tanks now emerged under glaring lights. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, built by Chrysler in 1940, became the heart of this revolution. It was the first factory in the world designed exclusively for the mass production of tanks. A single facility covering over 1 million square feet, with rail spurs feeding it like arteries, it could produce an M4 Sherman every 20 minutes at its peak. The line never slept. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Each tank passed through a symphony of motion. Steel plates welded, engines lowered, turrets fitted, paint sprayed. A dance of machines and human rhythm. Workers who had never seen a battlefield produced more armored vehicles than all of Europe combined. By 1944, the United States had built nearly 50,000 Shermans, while Germany struggled to finish a fraction of that number. Other plants followed. Fisher Body in Grand Blanc, Pressed Steel in Pennsylvania, Baldwin Locomotive in Philadelphia. They shared blueprints, standardized bolts, and interchangeable components. It meant that a tank damaged in Normandy could be repaired with parts from any other factory. A miracle of uniformity that German engineers found almost offensive. To the Germans, tanks were weapons of prestige, born of design perfection. To the Americans, they were instruments of logistics, replaceable, reliable, replicable. Every rivet was a statement of philosophy. Victory through quantity. The numbers were staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, U.S. factories produced over 88,000 tanks and over 600,000 military vehicles. The same industrial complex built over 300,000 aircraft and 5,000 merchant ships. By 1943, the U.S. was producing more war materiel than all Axis powers combined. Behind this colossal machine stood the planners and engineers who made it possible. William Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, became a lieutenant general, the only civilian industrialist to hold that rank. He coordinated the auto giants like divisions on a production front. Henry Kaiser, a shipbuilder, turned West Coast yards into miracles of speed, building a Liberty ship in under 5 days. At the peak of the war, American industry employed more than 18 million workers, nearly 1/3 of the nation's population. This industrial warfare was not without sacrifice. Factories were dangerous. Women worked 12-hour shifts beside molten furnaces. Men exempted from service labored in deafening plants. Children collected scrap metal for recycling drives. Entire communities became part of the war machine. And in Berlin, reports began to circulate through the Wehrmacht's general staff. Interrogated Allied prisoners spoke of an endless supply chain, of convoys arriving faster than they could be destroyed. German intelligence, analyzing production data, concluded that the United States had achieved what no European power ever had. Total mobilization without collapse. Albert Speer, reading captured reports in 1943, understood the meaning. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "Our opponents outstripped us not only in resources, but in the organization of their resources. They turned war into a matter of arithmetic." For the German officer at the front, it felt like something supernatural. Destroy 10 tanks, 20 more arrived. Bomb a convoy, and replacements appeared within days. Factories across an ocean seemed to defy geography, shipping power in steel hulls across the Atlantic. The American tank was not the strongest, but it was everywhere, on beaches, in forests, on the plains of Europe. Its strength lay not in armor, but in availability. By the end of 1943, the question for German command was no longer how to win, but how to keep up. The tide of war was no longer decided by generals or even soldiers. It was decided by machines, by workers, by the rhythm of assembly lines that never stopped. And soon, that rhythm would echo across every battlefield, in the rattle of Shermans rolling toward Europe. The tactical angle, a machine built for movement on paper, the M4 Sherman was unremarkable. Its 75mm gun was weaker than the long-barreled cannons of the German Panther or Tiger. Its armor could be pierced by nearly every German anti-tank weapon beyond 500 meters. And yet, the Sherman dominated the battlefield, not because it was invincible, but because it was always there. American doctrine valued mobility and coordination over raw armor. The Sherman was designed to move quickly, to exploit breakthroughs, to operate as part of a vast combined arms system. Infantry, artillery, and air support all synchronized through radio and logistics. It could cross bridges that heavier German tanks could not. It could be shipped by sea and repaired on site. Every unit had spare parts, manuals, and trained mechanics. The tank was an extension of a system, a cog in a machine of relentless efficiency. German crews feared the swarms more than the individuals. A Tiger tank might destroy 5 Shermans, but while the Tiger burned fuel, broke tracks, and waited for parts, 10 more Shermans would appear. It was attrition by abundance, and psychologically devastating. By mid-1944, American tank battalions could lose half their vehicles and still return to full strength within days. Replacement units arrived pre-trained, their tanks identical to the last. For the first time in military history, war was fought like an industrial supply chain. Destruction met with instant regeneration. This was what shocked the German command. In previous wars, replacing lost equipment could take months. Now, the Americans seemed to conjure entire armored divisions overnight. To the Wehrmacht's field officers, it felt less like warfare and more like drowning. Wave after wave, never ending. What they did not realize was that the true weapon was not the Sherman at all. It was the system that built, delivered, and maintained it. The Americans had mastered logistics as a form of combat. The industrial angle, the line that never slept inside the Detroit arsenal, time was measured in minutes, not days. Every 20 minutes, a tank rolled off the line. A fusion of automation and human will. Each worker knew their motion by heart. The welder's spark, the riveter's rhythm, the crane operator's swing. From raw steel to roaring engine, a complete tank emerged in less time than it took to cook a meal. This was the miracle of flow production. Unlike Germany's fragmented facilities, the American auto industry concentrated its effort. Engine blocks, transmissions, and turrets moved down parallel lines and converged at final assembly, where precision met speed. Efficiency engineers monitored every step. Wasted seconds were analyzed and eliminated. The result was staggering. By 1943, Chrysler alone had produced over 22,000 Shermans. Each cost roughly $50,000, less than a tenth the price of a Tiger Y. The United States could build 10 Shermans for every heavy tank Germany managed to assemble. The arithmetic was impossible to ignore. But the secret was not merely mechanical. It was human. The same men and women who had once built Buicks and Dodges now turned out tanks with the same pride and repetition. Every weld carried the rhythm of mass labor. Precise, practiced, unstoppable. Women made up a third of the workforce, their hands shaping armor plates and control panels. For many, it was the first time they had entered industrial work. Their efforts became the backbone of Allied strength. German observers, reviewing captured American equipment, noticed the simplicity of design. The Sherman's components were standardized, interchangeable across models. Engines could be swapped, guns replaced, radios fitted without modification. German tanks, by contrast, were mechanical masterpieces, but each was unique. Parts from one Tiger rarely fit another. Each repair required specialized tools, and every improvement slowed the next delivery. Albert Speer recognized this flaw too late. He attempted to consolidate production, to create a Panzerwaffe standard, but the war's demands and Hitler's obsession with innovation prevented it. The Americans had already reached the point of no return, an industrial tempo that could not be matched. This was not just production. It was industrial warfare perfected. The line in Detroit was as decisive as any front in Normandy. Each 20-minute cycle sent another armored heartbeat into Europe, and in that pulse lay the rhythm of victory. For every Tiger that rumbled into battle, 10 Shermans were already on the sea. While the world watched tanks thunder across Europe, another army fought its war in silence. The Industrial Army. They wore no uniforms. Their battlefield was lit not by tracer fire, but by welding sparks. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo, workers labored through sleepless nights under the roar of machines. Entire neighborhoods pulsed with the rhythm of shift changes. Women with rolled-up sleeves, their hair bound in scarves, replaced men who had gone overseas. They built engines, riveted hulls, and painted serial numbers that would later be seen on the beaches of Normandy and the roads of Berlin. These workers never met the soldiers who used their machines, but across oceans and continents, the two were bound together. When a Sherman rolled out of the Detroit arsenal, a small tag followed it, the names of those who assembled it. For many American tank crews, those names were a reminder that their survival rested on unseen hands. German intelligence, reviewing captured propaganda films of U.S. factories, dismissed them at first as exaggerations, but reconnaissance confirmed their accuracy. By 1943, the Luftwaffe's own reports admitted that the industrial depth of the United States was immeasurable. Factories hundreds of miles inland, far beyond the reach of bombers, worked without interruption. For the Germans, whose cities burned nightly under Allied raids, such security seemed almost otherworldly. For American workers, it was a burden carried with quiet pride. They knew the war was not only fought with bullets, it was fought with output. Every completed tank, every replaced bearing, was a weapon against tyranny. As one factory foreman wrote in a 1944 letter to his son serving in France, "You drive them, son. We'll build them faster than they can burn them." At the summit of power, two contrasting visions of warfare collided. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's obsession with technical superiority had warped the nation's armament policy. He demanded wonder weapons, colossal tanks like the Tiger II, rocket artillery, and jet aircraft. Each innovation was meant to offset Allied numbers with terror and technological shock. But these weapons, magnificent on paper, strangled production. They required rare metals, complex engineering, and endless testing. They were monuments to genius and to inefficiency. Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments in 1942, tried to impose order. He streamlined production, centralized logistics, and expanded labor through brutal exploitation of prisoners and forced workers. Under his management, Germany's output rose sharply in 1943. But it was already too late. Every increase in German production was met by an exponential increase from America. Across the ocean, Franklin D. Roosevelt and his military chiefs had chosen a different path. Their strategy was not brilliance, but balance. Rather than chase technological supremacy, they built systems of manufacturing, training, and maintenance. Generals like George C. Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower understood that modern war was not a duel of machines, but a duel of supply. The army that could replace its losses faster would prevail. The simplicity of the Sherman reflected that philosophy. It was not perfect, but it was enough, and enough, multiplied by tens of thousands, became overwhelming power. When Eisenhower toured tank depots in England before D-Day, he marveled at the organization. Lines of vehicles, identical in every detail, waiting for embarkation. Each bore a stencil mark, "Made in USA." It was not a boast. It was a warning. Even among German officers, recognition of America's industrial supremacy grew. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, later reflected that Germany had built tanks as if they were jewels, while the Americans built them as if they were bullets. That difference, he admitted, had cost Germany the war. Industrial war had transformed humanity's relationship with destruction. Where once victory belonged to strategy and courage, it now belonged to throughput and efficiency. This shift disturbed even those who benefited from it. In Washington and London, military planners began to realize the moral weight of their methods. Wars were no longer won by valor alone, but by factories that could outproduce entire nations. Each new tank rolling off the line represented not just strength, but surrender to an age where machines dictated destiny. For the Germans, this realization carried despair. Reports from the front were filled with bitterness. Officers wrote of soulless warfare, the sense that they were not fighting men, but industries. They could outfight American units tactically, but could not defeat a system that never tired, never paused, never ran out. And yet, for the Americans, there was pride mixed with unease. Many who worked the lines knew they were building instruments of death, but they saw it as the only path to peace. The very same assembly lines that had once symbolized progress now forged destruction on an unimaginable scale. After the war, some would call it the birth of the military-industrial complex. At the time, it was simply necessity. The moral cost of that transformation, from craftsman to conveyor, from soldier to statistic, would echo long after the last tank rolled off the line. For in mastering the art of mass production, humanity had also learned how to wage war without limit. Normandy, June 1944. The invasion began not with tanks, but with thunder. Allied warships pounded the French coast from horizon to horizon. The sky was filled with aircraft, the sea with ships. From every landing craft came the same olive-green shape, the M4 Sherman. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord unleashed the full weight of American production upon Europe. More than 6,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men crossed the Channel in a single day. For the Wehrmacht officers manning the bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, the view defied comprehension. Never before had they seen such abundance, not just of soldiers, but of machines. By mid-June, as the beaches were secured and the bocage fighting began, the scale of the onslaught became clear. Every road behind the front was a river of Shermans, jeeps, trucks, and fuel tankers. Engineers built new harbors, mulberry ports, to feed the mechanical tide. Pipelines, Operation Pluto, pumped gasoline directly under the channel. German commanders reported what they called material superiority beyond measure. At Saint-Lô, in Caen, in the fields of Normandy, panzer divisions fought courageously but hopelessly. A Tiger tank might ambush and destroy 5 or 10 Shermans, yet within hours new columns appeared, freshly fueled and repaired, pressing forward again. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division, later recalled his disbelief. It was as if the Americans had factories somewhere in France itself, producing tanks behind every hedge. To the Germans, accustomed to scarcity, this abundance was not just strength. It was a psychological weapon. Every explosion, every destroyed tank, meant nothing when replacements arrived before the smoke cleared. In July, the Allies broke out of the bocage. Operation Cobra unleashed the U.S. First Army into open country, where mobility and logistics, the American strengths, could finally breathe. Shermans raced through the French countryside faster than the Germans could react. Roads clogged with wrecked panzers and retreating infantry. For every German vehicle abandoned for lack of fuel, an American convoy carried thousands of gallons more. The battlefield became an arithmetic lesson in total war. The Wehrmacht had begun the Normandy campaign with roughly 1,500 tanks in France. Within 2 months, more than 2,000 American Shermans were in action, and more arriving daily. No matter how skillfully German crews fought, they could not replace their losses. Factories in Germany were bombed, railways cut, and supply lines strangled. By contrast, U.S. production did not pause. Even as tanks rolled through Europe, new ones were being welded in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. The system had achieved what the Germans thought impossible: uninterrupted, ocean-spanning logistics. The German High Command began to receive alarming reports. Captured documents revealed Allied production numbers that bordered on fantasy. A single American plant could produce more tanks in a month than all of Germany's surviving panzer divisions combined. And each destroyed tank was not just replaced. It was improved, repaired, or recycled. Albert Speer, reading frontline dispatches in Berlin, noted grimly that the balance of war had shifted permanently. His efforts to increase output had failed to close the gap. Germany's meticulously crafted tanks, each requiring weeks of handwork, were being outnumbered 10-1. By the time the Allies liberated Paris in August 1944, the truth was undeniable. The war in the West was now a contest between human precision and industrial rhythm. And rhythm had won. For the German soldiers retreating through France, the thunder of tank engines became a constant, a mechanical heartbeat that followed them from village to village. No matter how many Shermans they destroyed, the sound always returned. It was not the sound of a single army, but of a continent in motion. The front was no longer defined by lines on a map. It was defined by the reach of American production. And as the Allies advanced toward the German border, a final, desperate counterattack would test whether even this industrial tide could be stopped. Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Snow fell in heavy silence over the pines of Belgium. The war in Europe seemed to be nearing its end. The Allies were massed on Germany's western frontier, preparing for the final push to the Rhine. Then, on December 16th, the forest erupted. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by 1,000 tanks and assault guns, surged through the Ardennes in a surprise offensive. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's final gamble, a desperate attempt to split the Allied front and recapture Antwerp. For a brief moment, chaos reigned. American units were cut off, retreating under heavy snow and sudden bombardment. Entire divisions vanished into the mist. Among the attacking forces were the armored spearheads, Panzer Lehr, 2nd Panzer, and 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, equipped with the most formidable machines Germany could still muster, Panthers and Tiger IIs. Their heavy guns and thick armor tore through the thin-skinned Shermans at close range. In the first days, the offensive seemed unstoppable. Yet, beneath the surface, something deeper was unfolding. Every shell fired, every mile gained, burned fuel the Reich could no longer replace. The German supply lines were brittle, stretched through forests and frozen roads, relying on horse-drawn carts for gasoline. Their tanks advanced faster than their fuel trucks could follow. When they captured American supplies, they used them immediately, and then stalled. On the other side, the American logistical machine moved with astonishing speed. Convoys of trucks, the Red Ball Express, roared across France day and night, carrying ammunition, food, and replacement vehicles to the front. Even as snow and ice choked the roads, thousands of drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, kept the arteries of war flowing. Within days, entire armored divisions were redeployed from other fronts to meet the attack. Each came with rows of freshly arrived Shermans, drawn straight from the ports. At Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, the 101st Airborne Division held out under siege. The Shermans fought in white camouflage among the trees, their engines echoing through the valleys. Though outgunned, they were never outnumbered. For every tank Germany lost, America sent 3 to replace it. When the skies finally cleared on December 23rd, Allied aircraft joined the fight. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers, hundreds of them strafing and bombing the German columns. Trapped armor burned in the snow, and the offensive began to collapse. Within 3 weeks, the great gamble was over. Germany had lost over 700 tanks and tens of thousands of men, losses that could never be replaced. The Allies, though battered, replenished their forces almost instantly. Factories in the United States simply increased their shifts. Replacement vehicles were already en route before the battle had even ended. Captured German officers could not comprehend it. How could a nation lose hundreds of tanks one week and receive hundreds more the next? How could they replace entire armies faster than Germany could repair a single division? The answer, they realized, lay not in strategy or bravery, but in capacity. American factories had turned war into a continuous process. Where German industry fought battles of production, America fought battles of logistics. When the smoke cleared, the Ardennes were littered with wreckage, Tiger tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, Panthers destroyed by their own crews, Shermans burned and replaced, roads torn by tracks and craters. But in the aftermath, one truth was clear. Germany had exhausted its final reserves. Its industry could no longer sustain the war. Albert Speer would later describe the Battle of the Bulge as the point of industrial collapse. No matter how long the fighting continued, the outcome was sealed. The Reich had run out of steel, fuel, men, and time, while America's forges still burned. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht's war machine was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for delay. Every day, every battle, Every destroyed tank fought only hours against an enemy whose supply seemed infinite. And as the Allied forces rolled east in the spring of 1945, those endless columns of Shermans became the most visible symbol of inevitability. Not invincible, but unending. Not superior, but sufficient. Each one was born from a 20-minute rhythm that Germany could never break. The German officers who had once laughed at American factory warfare now watched their cities burn beneath the weight of that same industrial might. Precision had been defeated by production, artistry by arithmetic, and the age of the machine had claimed its first total victory. The war's turning point had not been fought by men alone. It was fought by the factories that never slept. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the full scale of the war's industrial imbalance came into focus. Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were rubble, its railways torn apart, its factories shattered under years of bombing. But, beyond the wreckage, historians and officers began to study why the Wehrmacht's might had crumbled so completely. And the answers were found not in tactics, but in production ledgers. The numbers were staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced over 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 300,000 aircraft, and over 41 billion rounds of ammunition. By contrast, Germany, even at its industrial peak under Albert Speer in 1944, produced less than half that output across all categories combined. Even as the Reich pushed its factories to the brink, American industry operated with room to spare. Captured German staff reports told a story of disbelief. One Wehrmacht general, interrogated in 1946, confessed, "We had assumed the United States would require 3 years to mobilize effectively. Instead, it took them 6 months." What stunned analysts was not just quantity, but continuity. While Axis production fluctuated wildly under bombing and resource shortages, American output rose steadily, month after month, peaking only after victory was already secured. The factories had become a perpetual motion machine. Once started, it could not be stopped. Historians later called this phenomenon total war by proxy. Unlike Germany or the Soviet Union, the United States never fought on its own soil. Its industrial heartland remained untouched, its railways unbroken, its workers well-fed. This insulation allowed the arsenal of democracy to function with mechanical precision, supplying not only its own forces but also those of Britain, the Soviet Union, and Free France. Lend-Lease statistics told the rest of the story. Over 400,000 American trucks were sent to the Eastern Front, carrying Soviet troops from Stalingrad to Berlin. Thousands of Shermans fought not only under American crews, but under British and Canadian command, even serving in Soviet units. The Allies' combined mechanization, largely American-built, overwhelmed the Axis in every theater. The German officers who once mocked the Sherman as inferior came to respect its consistency. It started in the cold, moved on any terrain, and could be repaired with basic tools. Captured reports from the panzer divisions frequently described it as tactically manageable, strategically undefeatable. For every tank Germany lost, it needed weeks to replace it. For every tank the Allies lost, the replacement was already on a ship or train before the wreck cooled. This gap extended beyond weapons. American logistics produced food, uniforms, and fuel with the same precision as tanks. Every soldier at the front was backed by 15 others in supply, transport, and maintenance. The Allied advance across Europe was not a single surge. It was a living supply chain, breathing in steel and exhaling power. In Washington, the War Production Board disbanded with little ceremony. Its task was complete. Factories slowly returned to civilian production, but many kept their wartime efficiency. Within months, Cars, refrigerators, and tractors once again rolled off the same lines that had built tanks and bombers. America had learned to harness industrial strength as a weapon and would never unlearn it. The lessons of this mobilization became doctrine. Future wars would no longer rely on immediate battlefield victories. They would be decided by who could outproduce, outlast, and outdeliver. Germany's officers, sitting in Allied captivity, reflected on that truth with quiet bitterness. The Tiger tank had been a masterpiece of engineering, but in the end, it was defeated by the assembly line. The war's outcome was not just a story of courage or command. It was the triumph of organization over obsession, of simplicity over sophistication, of industry over ideology. In the shattered offices of Berlin and the burned factories of the Ruhr, Allied investigators sifted through papers, blueprints, and reports. They were searching for the hidden engines of the Nazi war machine. But what they found instead was absence. There had never been enough. Not enough steel, not enough fuel, not enough time. Germany's war economy, once feared as unstoppable, had been built on illusion. The pursuit of perfection had devoured its own efficiency. Each new tank design, the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, was a masterpiece that demanded hours of skilled labor and tons of rare materials. Each improvement made it stronger on the field, but weaker in the war. Post-war analysts at the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey called it the over-engineering trap. They concluded that the Third Reich had defeated itself long before 1945 by valuing complexity over quantity. Even Speer, in his Spandau prison diaries, admitted, "We produced weapons of unmatched quality, but we built too few to matter. In the end, our factories were monuments to inefficiency." The contrast was total. While Germany spent weeks assembling a single tank, American factories used modular production, interchangeable parts, standardized tools, repetitive design. A tank destroyed on Tuesday could be replaced by Friday. The industrial age had made warfare elastic. Destruction was no longer final. This realization haunted European military thinkers for decades. If war had once been the realm of generals, it now belonged to engineers, planners, and supply officers. Every nation studied the American model. The Soviet Union adopted its methods immediately, developing massive, standardized production systems of its own. The Cold War would become not just an arms race, but a production race. Even peace itself bore the marks of wartime assembly. In 1945, the factories that had produced tanks now produced automobiles again, faster, cheaper, and in greater numbers than ever before. The same logic that had armed the Allies rebuilt their economies. Refrigerators, typewriters, and suburban homes became symbols of a consumer miracle born from the ashes of total war. In Germany, the lesson was personal. Many of the engineers who had built Panzers found themselves working for new companies, Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler, applying their wartime precision to peacetime purpose. The machine age had survived its own destruction. For the United States, victory brought introspection. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower, now statesman, warned of a new danger: the permanent fusion of war and industry. In his 1961 farewell address, Eisenhower would coin the phrase military-industrial complex, a system that could dominate national life if left unchecked. It was born not from malice, but from success. The war had proven that factories could win battles, and no one could forget it. In Germany, soldiers and officers who had once mocked American mass-production warfare wrote of their awe and disbelief. General Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, later wrote, "We had the better tanks. They had the better production. In the end, it was not courage, but capacity that decided." That truth echoed across all fronts. The tank that rolled out of Detroit every 20 minutes had not only crushed armies, it had rewritten the rules of modern conflict. When Allied historians gathered the numbers, the pattern was unmistakable. Wars would no longer be won solely by strategy, bravery, or genius. They would be won by the power to replace, the power to endure, the power to produce, and in that revelation lay both triumph and tragedy, for humanity had discovered that its greatest strength could also become its greatest peril. The same hands that built victory could just as easily build annihilation. In the quiet years after the war, when the factories fell silent and the soldiers returned home, the echo of machinery lingered. It was no longer the clatter of rivets or the thunder of engines. It was the realization of what humanity had built. The Second World War had proven something both magnificent and terrifying, that modern industry could move mountains, cross oceans, and decide the fate of nations. The battlefields of Europe and the Pacific had not only been won by courage, they had been won by capacity. Factories, once symbols of progress, had become instruments of survival. The M4 Sherman, simple and unremarkable, became the perfect symbol of that paradox. It was not the most powerful tank, nor the most beautiful, but it embodied the principle that changed the world. Quantity has a quality all its own. It represented a civilization that had learned to turn motion into power, repetition into victory. For the German officers who watched it roll across Europe, the lesson was clear. The age of craftsmanship had ended. War had entered the factory. The front line was now measured in conveyor belts and shipping manifests, and from that moment on, no nation could fight a global war without mastering production first. Yet beneath the statistics and steel lay a human truth. Every tank that crossed a battlefield had been touched by hundreds of unseen hands. Welders, drivers, mothers, machinists, each part of an invisible army that never carried rifles but bore the weight of victory. Their labor defined the 20th century. When Albert Speer reflected from his cell in Spandau, he wrote, "The war was lost not when our armies failed, but when our factories fell behind." It was an admission not just of defeat, but of evolution. From that moment, warfare could never again be separated from economics, from labor, from the rhythm of industry itself. The American factories that once built tanks returned to building cars, but somewhere, deep within their foundations, the echoes remained. A reminder that the power to create and the power to destroy had become one and the same. And in those 20 minutes between each new tank, the modern world was born.